Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story that honestly sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie. But I need you to understand something. What I'm about to share with you is based on real events that happened during one of the darkest periods in American military history. This is the story of Sergeant Michael Davidson, a young soldier from Tennessee who was left behind in the jungles of Vietnam in 1971. And here's the part that's going to blow your mind. 20 years later, in 1991, he walked out of that jungle alive. 20 years, alone, surviving in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This is a story about abandonment, survival, and the unbreakable will of a man who refused to die. So get comfortable, because this one's going to take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. The morning of April 3rd, 1971, started like any other morning in the A Shau Valley. Sergeant Michael Davidson, 24 years old, stood in the pre-dawn darkness with his squad, checking his M16 for the third time. The humidity was suffocating, the kind that made your uniform stick to your skin before the sun even rose. He looked at the faces around him: Jenkins, Rodriguez, Patterson, Kowalski. Boys, really. Most of them barely old enough to vote, but old enough to die. "All right, listen up." Lieutenant Brennan's voice cut through the jungle sounds. "Intelligence says there's a POW camp 6 clicks northeast. We go in, extract any Americans we find, and we exfil before Charlie knows what hit them. Fast and quiet. Questions?" Nobody had questions. They'd done this dance before. The war was winding down. Everyone knew it. Nixon was pulling troops out, but there were still men scattered throughout these jungles. Prisoners rotting in bamboo cages, waiting for someone to remember they existed. Davidson adjusted the dog tags around his neck and thought about his fiancée Sarah back home in Memphis. 3 more months and he'd be rotating out. 3 more months and he could forget this green hell forever. They moved through the jungle in single file, weapons ready, every sense heightened. Davidson was point man. He'd always had a 6th sense for ambushes, a feel for when the jungle was watching back. But that morning something felt different. The birds were too quiet. The insects had stopped their usual symphony. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. "Sarge," Jenkins whispered from behind him, barely audible. "Something ain't right." Davidson raised his fist and the entire squad froze. That's when he saw it. A thin wire stretched across the trail at ankle height. A booby trap. He was about to signal when the world exploded. The ambush came from 3 sides simultaneously. AK-47 fire ripped through the morning air, muzzle flashes sparking from the dense undergrowth. Davidson hit the ground, rolled behind a fallen log, and returned fire. The radio operator, Rodriguez, was trying to call in their position, screaming coordinates into the handset over the deafening chaos. "Fall back! Fall back!" Lieutenant Brennan was shouting. But half the squad was already down. Davidson saw Patterson get hit, saw the boy's body jerk backwards like a puppet with cut strings. Jenkins was screaming for a medic. The jungle had transformed into hell itself, smoke and blood, and the smell of cordite burning in the thick air. Davidson provided cover fire as the survivors retreated. His M16 was hot in his hands, magazine after magazine. He could see the NVA soldiers moving through the trees, dozens of them, maybe more. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a full company, maybe battalion strength. They'd walked straight into a hornet's nest. "Davidson, move!" Brennan was waving frantically, already 50 yards back with what was left of the squad. But Davidson saw Kowalski, gut shot and crawling, trying to reach cover. Without thinking, he broke from his position and ran. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. He grabbed Kowalski by the webbing and dragged him, firing one-handed at the advancing enemy. He almost made it. 20 feet from the tree line where his squad was covering, an RPG round hit a tree to his left. The explosion lifted him off his feet and threw him like a rag doll. He felt something snap in his leg, felt the air driven from his lungs. When he looked up, ears ringing, vision swimming, he saw Lieutenant Brennan's face, saw the impossible decision being made in real time. "We can't reach him. We gotta go now!" Someone was yelling. The NVA was closing in, their shouts getting closer. Davidson tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't hold. He raised one hand, tried to shout, but no sound came out. He watched through the smoke and chaos as his squad, his brothers, disappeared into the jungle. He watched the helicopter that had been called for extraction lift off in the distance, rotors beating the air like the sound of abandonment itself. And then he was alone, alone with the enemy closing in, alone with a shattered leg, alone in the middle of nowhere. The NVA soldiers swept through the area, checking bodies, and Davidson did the only thing he could do. He played dead. He lay there in the blood and mud, his own and others, and he didn't move, didn't breathe. Through slitted eyes, he watched boots pass inches from his face. He heard them talking, heard them laughing, heard them move on. When silence finally returned, hours later, Michael Davidson was officially a ghost. Back at base, they'd list him as KIA, killed in action. His name would go on a wall. His mother would receive a folded flag. Sarah would cry herself to sleep and eventually, slowly, move on with her life. But Michael Davidson wasn't dead. Not yet. The first few days were the hardest. He crawled, actually crawled, for 3 miles to get away from the ambush site. His leg was broken, possibly shattered. He made a splint from bamboo and vines, biting down on a stick to keep from screaming. He had no food, no water purification tablets, no map, no compass. He had a knife, the half-empty canteen, and a will to survive that bordered on supernatural. He knew the protocols. He knew which direction the American bases were supposed to be. But as the days turned into weeks, as he limped and crawled and dragged himself through that endless green maze, he began to realize something terrifying. The war was leaving without him. He'd hear helicopters sometimes, distant, but never close enough. He'd hear bombing runs, see the flashes on the horizon at night, but nobody was looking for him. Nobody was coming. By the second month, Michael Davidson accepted the truth. He was on his own, completely and utterly on his own. The jungle that had tried to kill him now became his only chance at survival. He watched the way local villagers moved through the forest, the plants they ate, the water sources they used. He learned to set snares for small game. He learned which insects were edible, which plants could heal wounds, which ones would kill you in hours. He found a cave hidden behind a waterfall deep in the mountains. It became his home. He marked the days on the cave wall with his knife, 1 line for each day, a crosshatch for each week. He talked to himself to keep from going insane, entire conversations with people who weren't there. He talked to his mother, to Sarah, to his dead squad mates. Sometimes he didn't know if he was awake or dreaming. The leg healed wrong, left him with a permanent limp. Infections nearly killed him twice. Once he was delirious for days, hallucinating, seeing things in the shadows. But somehow, impossibly, he survived. He became something that wasn't quite soldier, wasn't quite civilian, wasn't quite human anymore. He became a creature of the jungle, silent and careful, and always watching. Years passed. The war ended. American forces pulled out in 1973, but Davidson didn't know that. He had no idea the war was over, that all his brothers had gone home, that the world had moved on. He still operated on a mission: survive until rescue. Survive one more day, just one more day, then another, then another. He avoided villages, avoided people. Twice he saw American search teams in the late 70s, MIA recovery operations looking for remains. Both times he tried to approach, but fear paralyzed him. What if they thought he was VC? What if they shot first? What if they weren't real, just another hallucination? He'd been alone so long he didn't trust his own mind anymore. The marks on the cave wall grew. 1,000 days, 2,000, 5,000. He stopped counting somewhere around year 12. Time lost meaning. Seasons blurred together. Dry season, monsoon season, dry season, monsoon season. His hair grew long, matted with mud and leaves. His uniform rotted away until he was wearing clothes made from animal hides and plant fibers. He looked like something out of a prehistoric age, but he never forgot who he was. Every morning, he'd recite his name, rank, and serial number. Davidson Michael J. Sergeant, U.S. Army, RA 1984-7634. It was his anchor to sanity, his connection to a world that he was no longer sure existed. He kept his dog tags, though they were corroded and barely readable. He kept the photograph of Sarah, though it had long since faded to almost nothing. In the 20th year, something changed. Davidson was fishing in a stream when he heard voices, American voices. Not soldiers this time, but civilians. Tourists, maybe, or journalists. He followed them carefully, staying hidden. They had cameras, fancy equipment. They were talking about the war like it was history, something from a textbook. One of them mentioned the year, 1991. 1991. 20 years. 20 years he'd been in this jungle. 20 years of survival, of solitude, of slowly losing pieces of himself to the green hell. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The war had been over for 18 years. Nobody was looking for him, nobody was coming. He'd survived all this time for nothing, but that realization, instead of breaking him, freed him. For 20 years he'd been waiting for rescue. For 20 years he'd been stuck, frozen in April 1971, forever 24 years old in his mind, if not his body. But now he understood. If he wanted to go home, he'd have to walk out himself. On March 15, 1991, Michael Davidson walked out of the jungle. He'd been preparing for weeks, gathering supplies, studying the groups of tourists and locals to understand the modern world he was about to enter. He'd practiced speaking English again. His voice was rough, hoarse from disuse. He'd tried to make himself presentable, had even used a piece of broken mirror to cut his hair with his knife. He emerged near a small village on the edge of what had been a war zone and was now becoming a tourist destination. The first person to see him was a local woman carrying water. She dropped her bucket and ran screaming. He couldn't blame her. He probably looked like a demon, a ghost from the war that wouldn't die. But word spread. Within an hour, Vietnamese police arrived. Then officials from Hanoi, and this is when Davidson's legs nearly gave out, an American embassy representative. The man stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" the man asked in English. Davidson's voice cracked when he spoke, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Davidson, Michael J. Sergeant, U.S. Army, RA 19847634. I want to go home." The verification process took weeks. They had to confirm he was who he claimed to be. Dental records, fingerprints, DNA. His mother was still alive, now in her 70s, and they needed her confirmation. The story hit international news. American soldier emerges after 20 years missing in Vietnam. Some called it a miracle. Others called it impossible. Sarah had married someone else, had 3 children, had built a life. Davidson met her once briefly before he went back to Tennessee. She cried when she saw him, but they both knew. The boy she'd loved had died in that jungle 20 years ago. The man who came back was someone different, someone shaped by 2 decades of solitude and survival. Michael Davidson spent the rest of his life in a small cabin in the Smoky Mountains. He couldn't handle cities, couldn't handle crowds. The Veterans Administration tried to help. Therapy, medications, support groups. But how do you help someone process 20 years of isolation? How do you bring someone back from that? He gave one interview in 1993 to a military historian. In it, he said something that haunted everyone who heard it. "I survived 20 years in that jungle waiting for rescue, but the hardest part wasn't surviving. The hardest part was realizing that nobody was looking, that the world had forgotten I existed, that I'd become a ghost while I was still breathing." Michael Davidson died in 2009 at the age of 62. At his funeral, 3 members of his original squad attended: Jenkins, Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Brennan, all now old men themselves, all carrying guilt they'd held for 38 years. They'd left him behind. Orders or not, circumstances or not, they'd left their brother behind, and he'd survived anyway. Closing, so, what did you think of this story? I know it's intense. I know it's heavy. And I need to tell you something important here. This is a dramatized and fictionalized narrative that I've created for educational purposes. While Sergeant Michael Davidson, as I've described him, is a fictional character, stories like this, soldiers being left behind, MIAs surviving for years in hostile territory, these were real situations that happened during the Vietnam War. The confusion, the chaos, the impossible decisions made in combat, the men who vanished and were never found. All of that is historical fact. The Vietnam War left over 1,600 Americans still listed as missing in action. Some were killed and their bodies never recovered. But there were verified cases of soldiers surviving for extended periods, of men emerging years later, of families waiting decades for answers that never came. The psychological impact of war, of abandonment, of extreme survival situations, these are very real traumas that veterans still deal with today. I created this story to honor that reality, to make us think about the human cost of war, about the men who fell through the cracks, about the strength of the human spirit even in the darkest circumstances. Whether it happened exactly this way or not doesn't matter. What matters is that it could have, and in many cases, something similar did. So now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Michael's situation? Could you have survived 20 years alone? And here's what I'm really curious about. Do you know any stories like this from your own family? From your region, stories of survival against impossible odds? Stories of people who were left behind but found their way back? I'd love to hear them in the comments. And tell me, what city are you watching this from right now? I always love knowing where our community is located. How far these stories travel? Drop your city in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you think, do me a favor, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates military history or stories of human resilience, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've got so many more stories like this to tell, stories that need to be remembered, stories that honor the sacrifices people made. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong out there.